lesson plans, right? They need to produce some teaching tasks. And in their first course, they're not student teaching yet. So it's all theoretic. It's, they're producing something, but not for an actual classroom. So for the ELA class, the language arts class, all the texts that I provide for them to choose from to work on their first lesson plans all center on populations who've been pushed out of mainstream. So there's Native American text from a famous Native American author, but at the high school and middle school level, so that I know that they're having this opportunity, whether they get that exposure in the field or not, to work with what would be perhaps controversial text or a text that is less likely to be centered for their instruction, so they get grounded in how to teach and pull forward those topics, those issues, and so that even if they move into a space where they don't have models of anyone doing that, they've had this practice, they've had this. And that's true in our science courses, in our math courses, and in our world language courses. So that's the fall course is sort of anchor space for that.
Thank you.
Okay. And then winter term they move into methods, and they have to teach largely what is in existence in their field placements, because the different schools require different scope and sequence, so they're going to have to adopt whatever is there. So we know that we need that fall opportunity for them to do some design and thinking around some different materials. Mm-hmm.
How, if at all, are learning opportunities for developing racial identity and culturally responsive skills for teaching explicitly represented in syllabi?
So that's, I guess, going to be part of what I just said, where we have a 3-course sequence that's around ed psychology, which is race identity formation, and culturally responsive pedagogy sits inside of that too. So that 3-course sequence actually starts with a workshop in the summer, and the workshop is called Welcoming Schools, and it's very much focused on who we are as instructors, what we bring into schools, what identities are present in schools, and how those identities impact access to education and impact kids' opportunities. So that's a 1-day overview workshop, because the students are about to go into September experience in classrooms, and we want them to be able to kind of deconstruct what's happening in classrooms. After the Welcoming Schools, they do a Learning Foundations course, and in the Learning Foundations course, we explicitly talk about identity formation, and that's relationship with all the different learning theories. So not only cultural, let me peek at your question again.
It is number 5.
Racial and cultural identity, racial identity and culturally responsive skills. So it talks explicitly about those things in the Foundations of Learning course, and about diverse neurodiversity, because that issue is also sort of erased in the ways that we prepare pre-service teachers to think about learning and teaching and instruction. So whether it's neurodiversity, racial diversity, cultural diversity, any sorts of diversity that kind of get flattened when you start reading teacher ed material, that first Learning Foundations class explicitly unpacks that. And then they go into September experience in the field and have conversations where they do a cultural biography of the classroom. They look for the community-based assets in that learning space. They do an analysis of the school talk of the staff and the ways in which the staff are, and they have texts for that. So school talk is also a text that Mika Paul wrote. And so in school talk, they're paying attention to the ways in which intelligence is narrated in the school, identity is narrated in schools, achievement is narrated in schools, how the staff is imagining, speaking, and creating the possibilities and the impossibilities inside the school. So they're basically like ethnographers in September at tracking how, okay, we've learned all these things about learning and thinking, and then now we're seeing what could be seen and what can't be seen by the way academics in that space talk. In the winter, they do what would be the equivalent anywhere of a behavior management course. It has trauma-informed practice in it. It has all of the PBIS, culturally responsive PBIS. That's all explicit in that text too, or in that course too. What we're going to call the systems for supportive learning communities. So what kind of systems would we put in place? And in that course, there's also a central focus on culturally responsive, learner-centered, community-centered modes of thinking about student experiences. Trauma-informed practice and restorative practices are the focus on supporting and potentially redirecting, right? So where behavior management is normally centered. So that's the second piece of that. And then the third piece of it is that in their spring term, they take the final of that course. They have a 3-course sequence in each of our proficiencies. The final course in that is to go deep around equity and difference questions. So the third course is called Cultural Context of Schooling. They're in their spring student teaching placement, and they're to design some sort of rich project while they're in their full-time student teaching that is around the cultural context issues in their actual placement. So they go, core theory is foundations, creating supportive learning communities is application, and then cultural context of school is now taking that to a full-on project with your school.
Great.
Yeah. You can have that back.
I'd love to have these memorized, but I don't at this point. What learning activities, and you've kind of spoken to these, but maybe a little more explicit about the activities, but what learning activities and experiences are provided to teacher candidates for developing their culturally relevant practices and culturally responsive pedagogy?
What I was just talking about was their lesson plan and unit designs are focused around issues of equity and inclusion. So that requires that be the central focus of what they're up to. And so maybe helpful if I offer one from a different content area. Jenny Roof is our faculty who does math education, and she just came in and shared one with me yesterday. I'm trying to remember the whole one, but it was a math project that involves statistics. And she just shared it with me, so I said we need to put that onto a infographic so we can explain it to people. But I know one from a couple of years ago where we had a math instructor, and they have to design something that has culturally responsive frames in it and includes marginalized voices in whatever the topic is. So we had a math instructor who designed a project around water. And it ended up being an interdisciplinary project, but the math equation was they had to get on a world map, they had to look at the world map for clean drinking water locations, then they had to read about that region and how transportation occurred and who was responsible for getting the water. It was typically children, and the distance traveled, and then they had to set up equations for, in a household, how many gallons of clean water were necessary for a family. They had a week's, and so this was an entire project, but it was a math class, and it was a math project. And so they had to calculate the volume of water necessary for a family for a week period of time, the volume of water that a person could carry on foot, the distance from clean drinking water for the family, and then the time necessary for a child to retrieve that water each week, and then build a schedule for their child. So they each had sort of a model or adult, but typically in most of the places that they looked up, it was kids that were responsible for going and getting, and they could carry, 2 buckets of water from 1 to 5 to 15 miles away, right? So they had to do all those calculations and then produce their individual narratives. It was a math project, and it was entirely designed by Marty, the student, but it was designed because the central requirement was, how are you going to have this be a culturally responsive topic? How are you going to bring forward the voices of marginalized communities? And teach math, right? So how do you do that? So that's not an uncommon design in math or in science. And world language lends itself to that in the first place, and social studies and language arts lend themselves to the unit designs that can do that work anyway. So it's a heavier lift for math and STEM folks to shift their thinking because it's not how they were taught.